This tutorial will take you through an example for assignment number 8. In this assignment, we're going to be producing an evolutionary diagram that relates either to your studio project's building form or one of the tectonic elements within your studio project. What I mean by evolutionary diagram is a step-by-step diagram that shows the evolution of the form or the tectonic language of a specific element within your project from a simple platonic solid to the specific object in the end. So here you can see this is an example of one of my own projects, starting with a simple block, doing some manipulations to that block, and then finally ending up with the designed object in the end. So your evolutionary diagram should have a minimum of 4 steps. This one has 6, and I'll take you through an example of what we're going to produce with this diagram. So similar to previous assignments, we're going to start by modeling everything in Rhino. I've already done that, so you'll have to do that as well and decide which part of your studio assignment would best lend itself to this assignment. And even if you haven't finished your studio assignment all the way, I think you can use this assignment to advance the design that you're already working on. So don't feel like you have to do something that's already done or finished within your studio projects. Feel free to use this as an opportunity to further design the projects that you're working on. So once everything is modeled, we're going to do the same thing as always. Set an infinity plane. Place the sun in the design file. Set 2 basic materials. In this case, I've done a white material for my object and a very light gray. You can see here it's very light gray for the ground plane, just to set those 2 objects apart from one another. And then you're also going to update your V-Ray options similar to the way that we have done in the past. Once you have all of those things set, you're going to define a parallel line view. So here you can see I've produced a parallel line view that closely approximates an axonometric view, and I've saved that as a named view, parallel. Then we're going to go through and we're going to render each one of these steps in the diagram. And we're also going to make 2D of each one of those steps as well. So you can see here that I've already done my make 2Ds. I'm going to go through and produce the renderings as well. And then we'll look at them in Photoshop, clean them up, bring them into Illustrator, and add some line weights and color. When establishing your axonometric or parallel line view for these renderings, it's important to use the object or the iteration that takes up the most amount of screen space. So in this case, for me, that's this object. So I'm going to use that to define my parallel line view. And then I'm going to physically move each one of these objects into the exact same location. So you can see I've made a couple of crosshairs here so that once I'm done rendering an individual piece, I can move that out of the way and move the next one into that space. And the reason we're doing that is we want to ensure that the renderings of these objects are all the exact same size. So if I'm zooming in and out, one of these renderings might be a little bit too small, another one might be too big. This will make sure everything's consistent and make it so that we don't have to do a lot of work after the fact in Photoshop or Illustrator. Okay, I'm ready to render my first object, so I've positioned that at the crosshairs. I'll set my view to the parallel view, and I'm going to, before I do that, I'm going to hide all of these objects so they don't show up in the rendering, just for the time being. Okay, now I'll set my view and hit render. Okay, you'll see that I've gotten the aspect ratio from my image or my screen, my modeling screen, and applied that to the render settings in the camera. I've also added a sun, and I've positioned it so the shadow can be seen in this rendering. And you'll want to make sure that you're rendering at a minimum of 2000 pixels in width. Okay, so I'll save that image. I'll show the objects that I hid. I'll lock the default layer just so I can move everything quickly. I'll select everything, and then from the same exact point, I'm just going to shift all the objects over. And then again, I will hide the elements that I'm not currently rendering. Reset my view to parallel. and then render the next object. And I'll keep doing this for the remainder of the objects. We'll take a look at those in Photoshop. Okay, now that I've finished doing all of the renderings for the different iterations of my diagram, I'm going to export all of the line work to Illustrator. I find it easier to space and lay out the line work in Rhino prior to exporting. So you can see here I've made a consistent spacing, and then I've copied that and used that as the spacing between the limits of each one of these diagrams. So I'll export that in the same way that I've done in the past. Select everything, export selected, find the folder, it's an Illustrator file, I'm going to do a snapshot of the current view because I'm modeling at full scale, and you should be as well. Make sure to model your objects from your studio projects at the actual scale they would be built at. And I will change this to CMYK as well. Click OK. And next we'll look at Photoshop. Okay, I've gone through and rendered all of different iterations for the diagram. You can see that I've changed the ground color to a dark gray. Originally I thought maybe I'd want to keep the ground as a part of the images, but now I'm thinking I just want to leave the shadow and get rid of the ground altogether. So in order to make it easier to select and delete in Photoshop, I've gone back and made it a darker color so that it doesn't blend in as closely with the colors of my object. So you can do it, you can start to erase the background in one of three ways that we discussed previously. You can try the magic wand to see if that will give you an accurate selection. You can use the lasso tool, or you can draw paths and delete the background. I think the magic wand is going to work for me. So first I'm going to go and unlock the layer. So I'll double click on it, click OK. And I'll use the magic wand. I've set my tolerance to 10 just to be a little bit more accurate. And I've clicked. Now all I have to do is hit delete, and because I've unlocked the layer, it'll delete the background. There we go. And I also want to get rid of the shadow on these objects that I'm pulling away from my form. I'll leave the shadow of the form there, but I just want these kind of to be more abstract. So I'm going to eliminate these other shadows. If you turn caps lock on, you can get a more accurate cursor. Okay, I'll hit Control 0 to zoom out. And now I don't need all of this extra room on the side, so I'm going to crop the image. I'll go to Image, Canvas Size. And right now you can see it's 13 high by 28 wide. I'll take this down. Let's try 16. And this point here will show where it will crop from. So I'm going to crop it equally on all sides. So I'll leave it in the center. And it'll tell me that it's going to cut some of the image off, and that's okay. Hit proceed, and that looks better. Okay, now I can adjust the image, so I can go in here, adjust the brightness, the levels, exposure, hue, saturation, or vibrance, just to make it a little bit brighter. It's a little dark right now, so I'll make some adjustments, and then I'll do the same thing to all the other rendered images, and then we'll bring them into Illustrator. Okay, I've finished editing each of the images in Photoshop, and I've saved them all as Photoshop files, PSDs. This will allow me to import them into Illustrator and maintain that transparent background. There's other file types that will allow you to do this as well, but this just seems pretty easy at the moment. I've also opened up my line work in Illustrator and gave it some default line weights just to begin with. So let's start with the last one. I'll bring it in here. And you can see that the magic lasso distorted the image a bit when it cropped it. So if you want to be more precise, and you definitely should want to do that, use the polygonal lasso or paths to cut out the background from your images. Okay, so I'm going to put this into the corner similarly to the way we've done it in the past. And then I'm going to use the scale command. I'll move the center to that corner, and then now I'll just start to drag corners until, holding down Shift, until this thing fits nice and neat in that line work. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go through and do the same thing for all of the other images, get those lined up with their line work. I also, as I'm doing this, I made 2 additional layers in here. So the lines is the original line work. I have a color layer for the color that we'll be adding in a minute, and then the renderings layer. So this was put on the color layer. I'll just select that object and make sure it goes onto the rendering layer. And I'll put all my other renderings on that layer as well. It's going to be the lowest layer in our layer dialog box so that it's behind all the other information. Okay, now that I've placed all of the renderings behind the line work, I'm going to set up some of the line work to add color. So I'm going to lock the renderings layer to make sure that doesn't go anywhere. I'm going to turn that off. And now I have my line work layer open. I'm going to copy this and paste in front, or you could do paste in place. That'll ensure that it's being pasted in the exact same spot. And now I'll just take the block and drag it down to the color layer. So if I turn off the lines layer, now I have all my line work on the color layer. And for the purposes of this assignment, I want to separate my line work from my colors, just so I have a little bit more control over the manipulation of those 2 elements. So I'll select everything, and I'll start to do a live paint group. So here on the left-hand side, we have the live paint bucket. I'll click inside, and you can see now it's activated as a live paint group. So I can pick any color that I want. Let's say I want that green, and apply it. And you'll see the lines are still there. We actually don't need those lines, so I'm going to select everything, click the stroke so that that is in front and active, and then I'll click none because I don't want any strokes for the color layer. Okay, now I'm going to start to define and create a color palette. So I think the color palette is going to be really important for this assignment. You'll want to experiment with a few different color palettes. We'll go over some of the basics of color theory in the lecture this week. But I'm going to start with a specific color that I like. Pick that one. And you'll see if I go up here to the color guide on the right hand side, I have a series of options, and it gives me some colors that might start to relate to the one that I've selected. So if I click the down arrow, you see you get all of these different options. We'll go over what some of these mean in the lecture this week. But I want to use an analogous color scheme. That's colors that are of generally the same tone. You don't have to do this for your assignment, but I think it tends to look nice, so I'm going to do it for mine. So I'm going to click analogous, and then I'm just going to pick three colors. So once I have a color that I like, you'll see it shows up in the fill box down here. If I want to make sure I'm selecting the same color over and over again, I can go to my swatches tab and just take that color and drag it into the swatches tab. Now I'll go back into the fill, pick another one, drag that into the swatches tab, and then I'll pick a third. Drag that. Okay. Now what I can do is I can use the rendering as a guide to start to apply these colors. So I turn the rendering on. You'll see I have a light, a middle tone, and a dark tone. I'll just follow the same pattern that I have here on these objects. So the light will be all of the top surfaces, the middle will be all of the left-hand side surfaces, and the dark will be the right-hand side surfaces. So I'll go back to my paint bucket tool. I'll start with the light, and I'll just go in and fill in all of those surfaces with that color. Okay, now that I have the color applied to all the different surfaces, I'm going to lock the lines layer and the renderings layer just so that I have access to the color layer. So you may be looking at this and wondering, why did we do the rendering if it's just going to get covered up by color to begin with? There's a couple things we can do to the color now that we've applied it and allow the rendering and the different shade and tone that's in the rendering to start to show through. So if we select all of the objects on the color layer and click on transparency, the first thing we could do is we could just give all of the color transparency. So let's say 70%. And you can see what that does is it dulls down the color, but it also allows the rendering to start to show through. So we see the shadows and the effects of the different tone on the different surfaces. I'm going to undo that. The other thing you can do on this transparency tab, you'll see a drop down, and there's a series of options that will allow you to affect the rendering below in different ways. So if you select darken, it takes the rendering information below and the color that you've produced and darkens that color onto the rendering. So go through and take a look at what all of these might do. Multiply is a nice one. I think that tends to look really good. Color burn, also you get this kind of highly saturated effect. Overlay is one where it kind of just very lightly changes the color, or color, which is just in a generic way kind of applies that color to the rendering below. So the ones that I like to use are color, overlay, or multiply. For this rendering, to me it looks like the color looks pretty good. So I'm going to use the color, and I'm not going to give it any transparency, but you can see the shadows and the rendering information from below is starting to show through on this object. Okay, now that we have the color set, we'll go back in and we'll start to assign different line types to the lines that we've created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and change the outline to be a slightly thicker line weight. So I'll select all of those lines and change that, let's say, to 0.5. Missed one. Now we can look at what that looks like. Okay, that looks interesting. You see the outline of the figure. For me, that's important. The other thing we can do is we can go in here, and I've drawn these kind of action lines that suggest the removal of different solids from this object. So I want those to be dashed. So I'm going to select those and go here to my stroke tab. And then if I click on this drop-down arrow and hit show options, you'll see all these other options come up. I want it to be a dashed line, and I'm going to change it to a small dash. Let's try 4 point. See what that looks like. It's still a little bit big. I think for when you're making dashed lines, you want to err on the side of a really small dash or a tight dash. That tends to look better. So 2 point looks pretty good. The other thing you could do, you can control, you'll see here dash gap, dash gap. You can control the size of the gap if you wanted to. So let's say you wanted a 4 point dash and a 2 point gap. You can see there you get a long dash and a short gap. You can go through and keep adding elements to this, and it'll change it accordingly. So you want 6 and 2. So you can create center lines and all different kinds of line types for this with this option. We don't really need to do that for this assignment, but just so you know that is there. I'm going to keep it at 2 point. That seems to look good. So I'll go through and apply my different line types to the lines layer. If while you're assigning lines or going through and adjusting the lines, you find that you're missing a line, you can always add the line in Illustrator, so it's not the end of the world. You don't have to go back to Rhino and do that. So here I'm missing a line. I'm just going to use the line tool. I have my smart guides on, which are like O-snaps for Illustrator. That'll allow me to pick the corner, the anchor point, in that corner. And you can see I have it on the dash line. Click that off, and that adds the line back in place where it needs to be. You might also notice as you're going through and assigning a thicker line weight to the outline, that as you select some lines, you'll get this overlapping condition. You can always shorten that line and then redraw the missing part back in. Or if you want to, you could also create another layer. Let's call it outline. And you could use that layer and just go around and trace over the outline. You can do that either with the pen tool. I'd recommend locking the lines if you're doing that. And make sure you change your stroke to 0.5, or you could do it with individual lines. The pen is nice because you can get all of the lines at once. And that can be an easy way to create your outlines as well. Okay, I've gone through and added all of my line weights and line types. So you can see I've created a thicker boundary for the outline and added dashed lines in where I'm showing action. So this is showing the removal of some solids from these initial blocks. This is showing a series of kind of extrusions that are going to happen. This is showing kind of these faces being pushed in. And you'll notice that, again, I want to reiterate again, the rendering in the background is not cropped very nicely to that line work. So you're definitely not going to want to use the magic wand. I think using paths or the polygonal lasso will make that image much cleaner. Okay, so the last thing that I want to add here now is some action. So I just described in words what was happening to these different iterations. So this one, you can clearly see these initial 3 blocks are being shifted or pushed one way or another. So what I want to do now is add some arrows that start to describe those actions. So I'm going ahead, I've locked all of my other layers so they're not going to move. I've created a new layer called arrow, and I want my arrows to be at the same kind of angle as the drawing. So I'm going to use the drawing as a guide, and because I have everything locked, it's easy to do. So I'm just going to use the simple line tool. I'm going to draw over the top of this line. You'll see I already have a stroke in play. Let's just set that to 1 to begin with. And now I'm going to just position this line where I want that arrow to be. So you can see here I'm going to put an arrow that's suggesting that this block and that block are being pushed out from the center. So if I select that line and if I go to my stroke tab, you'll see under dashed line I get a series of options for arrowheads. The left hand side would control an arrowhead on the left hand side of the object. So in this case I don't want anything on the left hand side, so I'll hit Control Z and undo that. And then the right hand side will control the arrow on the right hand side. So I think choosing the arrow type is important. Like, don't choose these types. These just look a little bit cheesy. You want something nice and simple. So for my purposes, I think any of these 3 or 4 look good. Just a simple triangle. So I'm going to do arrow 7. And you'll see that when it comes in, it's relatively big. So it's maybe a little bit misscaled. And I can change its scale by changing the percentage over here. So if I change it to 40%, it gets much smaller. You'll notice also, let's say I want to make that line thicker. I don't know, let's say 4 point. Once I change the line weight, the arrowhead also changes its size. So again, I got to make that smaller so that we can see it. Okay, maybe 4 point is a little too big. Let's try 3. And I will change its size to 30. Okay. You also notice I'm getting a little bit of a rounded edge here. I don't want that. I want it to be straight and flat. So up here on cap, I can choose the type of cap that I want. Projecting cap or butt cap. I'm going to do butt cap so that I can show exactly how long that line is. So the arrow is looking a little bit short. I'm going to extend it a little bit. I'll select it. I'll pick a corner. Just hold down Shift, and if you hold down Shift and drag from a corner, you'll be ensuring that it's dragging along the axes of the original line. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. Now I'm going to make it dashed as well. So it looks like a dashed arrow kind of pushing against that solid. So that's how you create your different arrow types. You can always select it and go back in and adjust things accordingly. Maybe I want to make the arrowhead a little bit larger. If I want to copy the arrow from one place to the next, so for instance, let's say I make this a little bit longer, get one more line in there. Let's say I want to use this exact same arrow down here on the bottom portion. I can select it, hold down Alt, and you'll see that little white arrow appears. Now when I click and drag, if I hold down Shift, I can drag in a perfectly vertical fashion. And when I let go, it'll make a perfect copy of that arrow. So that's a good way to copy the arrow exactly as it is around your drawing. And that will ensure that you don't change the angle or whatnot as you're moving it around. So let's do it one more time. I'll do the same thing over here. In this case, I want this arrow to be here, but I want the arrowhead to be on the other side. So I'm going to select none for that side, arrow 7 for the other side, and again I think I had it at 35%. So I get my arrow going in the other direction. Okay, so I'll go through and populate the arrows for the rest of this drawing, and then we'll be finished with the diagram. Okay, you can see I've gone through and added my arrows. I changed the scale and the stroke and the size of the arrow in some of the later iterations of the formal diagram. And that's because the forms get a little bit tighter and the moves get more intricate as they move along. So I think it's okay to mix different sizes of arrows. You might experiment also with different colors or different types of arrows that mean different things. So for instance, I could use one arrow type that meant subtraction, another one that meant shifting, and maybe another one that meant pushing and pulling. That's something that you can look at on your own. But for the most part, this is how your diagram should look. It should be an evolutionary diagram that takes us from a simple Platonic element through a series of operations to the final designed form. So even if your object isn't designed in this fashion, and most objects aren't, I think you can still invent a story or an evolutionary diagram that could in some way describe how this thing was possibly created. Okay, so that's the end for the tutorial for assignment number 8. You'll save this, export it as a JPEG, upload to Tumblr, print it out in color for your lab, and then upload all the files to D2L.